Last week, I had the chance to play the new Dead Space remake coming out in 2023, and through my entire play session, there was one question running through my mind. How the hell are they possibly gonna live up to the standards of the original game? So today we're gonna take a look at how the devs have answered that question. Please keep in mind that I was playing an early build of the game that had several known bugs that have already been fixed. I'll talk about this more at the end in more depth, but if you do see things that are a bit janky during this video, that's probably the explanation for it. The original Dead Space came out in 2008, fairly early in the life cycles of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Its development was led by Glenn Schofield and Michael Condrey, who interestingly would go on to create Call of Duty World War II and have a strong hand in the creation of the zombies mode in that game. But Dead Space massively outshone anything they did in that area. In fact, Dead Space 1 is often considered one of the greatest video games of all time, thanks in part to the incredible sense of immersion and terror and paranoia that is present throughout the entire game, and it only gets worse as you get further into it, playing as Isaac Clarke, an engineer aboard a spaceship called the USG Ishimura. Since the original game's release, we've had multiple spin-off games such as Extraction, Ignition, and a mobile game. There's been Dead Space 2 and Dead Space 3. There were multiple comics, novels, anime, like the list goes on for how they've expanded and extended the universe of Dead Space. And this has turned out to be a pretty double-sided coin, because on the one hand, it means that there are enormous fan expectations for any kind of remake touching Dead Space 1 to be perfect, and on the other hand, it means that the devs have had this treasure trove of material that they can use for reference while they are going back and remaking the game. When the first one came out, they didn't know what Dead Space 2 and 3 would look like. They didn't know what the anime might do in terms of expanding the plot. All those sorts of things have been a real boon for the dev team because it's meant that they've got a better understanding of what really makes Dead Space, Dead Space. God, I feel like I'm going to say that a lot in this video. So let's jump into some specifics. They have expanded the narrative and the lore of the game, and the most obvious way that they've done that is by giving Isaac, the main character, the guy you play as the entire time, a voice.
I found a shark pad I can use on the barricade.
He didn't speak in Dead Space 1, very silent protagonist vibes, and that really contributed in a lot of ways to the isolation of it all. Everything felt a lot more empty because of that, because you weren't filling the space in the same way that you would if you did talk. But it was also a little weird because you're getting told to do all this stuff and you just nod your head and go along with it. Now, I'm sure it'll be a relief to hear that he is going to be voiced by Gunnar Wright, who voiced Isaac in Dead Space 2 and 3, so it makes sense that they would bring him back. And they've been really careful about the way that they have implemented this new voice. So, for example, Isaac will never initiate a conversation in the game. There isn't a point where he's just going to be like, I want to have a chat, and it breaks your immersion. They knew that that was so far a departure from what they did in Dead Space 1 originally that they wanted to avoid it completely. He won't speak unless he's spoken to, and that includes moments where there might be a kind of jump scare in the game, some very loud noise, Isaac very clearly is scared, his heart rate goes up, etc. But he's not going to come out with some, oh, what the hell is going on here, man? Like, that's not going to happen. To facilitate the conversations that he does have with characters, there are now these hologram pop-ups that might happen at various points in the story. So, for example, Hammond might respond to something that Isaac does in the game, and then they have a brief conversation based on that, and you move forward with your objective. They've also rewritten most of the text logs in the game, so they feel more connected to the expanded universe of Dead Space now that all that stuff exists. And you're gonna get a lot more backstory. You're gonna get info on what happened during the outbreak. You're gonna get more info on what Nicole was doing at that time. Like, all sorts of stuff has been fleshed out in a way that we might have learned about a little from other Dead Space media since the original game, but that wasn't possible at the time in 2008. Now, I did ask whether that means that certain things from the past are no longer canon, but they didn't have an answer for me on that. So we might find some discrepancies that the community are going to kind of argue about, but we'll save those arguments for when the full game comes out in 2023. One of the methods of delivering some of that new lore content is through narrative side quests, and the majority of those just give you some kind of narrative reward as you go along and then at the end as well. But there's also one side quest in particular which the devs kind of called out as being particularly gameplay related, but I don't know what the hell that means. They were very secretive about it, but there are new side quests now, so we have that to look forward to, and the intention there is they did want some elements to surprise returning players. So it does have the feel of the old game completely, but but there is a little bit of new stuff to do. There are new rooms, there are new routes, and new obstacles as well, new puzzles that you're gonna have to find ways around. As part of that attempt to kind of have the player re-explore the ship a bit more with those side quests and things, they've decided to make the game one continuous and unbroken shot. There are no loading screens unless you die. The ship is fully interconnected. You can walk from point A to point B with no interruption other than potentially some creepy crawlies attacking you. And I have to say, that felt fantastic in my play session. It was just glorious sitting down and 30 minutes later realizing that you hadn't stopped kind of fighting your way through the necromorphs that are throwing themselves at you. It really contributed to the tension of it all and is a really wonderful change for the remake. To help out with that, they've added new UI map controls and they've improved the locator. And to hinder you while you re-explore the ship, they've added an AI director, and its goal is to dynamically adjust the intensity of what's happening to you at any given time. It can control necromorph spawns, it can choose how they attack, it affects the environment, light, smoke, particles, sound, all of that are under the control of this intensity director, and it's mainly going to show up more often than not in revisits to areas. So you decide to backtrack because you're like, oh, maybe I need some of the ammo that I dropped in a previous room, and as you track back thinking you're safe, the game goes, nope, I'm gonna throw some sound at you, but nothing else. Maybe it's just sound, just to kind of keep you on your toes, or maybe the game decides that things are gonna get really intense and it's gonna spawn stuff in to attack you. That director also plugs in to the Alive system, which basically keeps track of Isaac's body as he progresses through any given moment in the game. Maybe something scary happens, Isaac's heart rate is going to go up. He also has a base resting respiratory rate, his breathing is going to be affected differently in different encounters, his stress levels, his limbic system controlling his fear and paranoia and anxiety, all of that basically on the back end of the game has a state now which the director can see and can therefore make things even worse for the player if it so chooses, based on what would cause the most trouble for Isaac. The Alive system also modifies the way that Isaac delivers his lines if he is in a conversation. So if someone's chatting to you and you're at low health and your breathing's really exerted, your voice lines aren't going to just be the normal voice lines. You're going to sound like you're at death's door.
Nicole? It's me. Nicole? It's me.
They've paid a huge amount of attention to detail in this area. I actually really recommend this one dev diary video that they did, which shows just how far they've gone to try and take what was fantastic in the original game, but tweak it to be more modernized. For example, in the original game, if Isaac got out of breath and scared, it would play that heavier breathing over the top of the sound of his regular breathing. And so all those things now have been smoothed out and made much more immersive. And it's not just Isaac's body that the devs have paid a lot of attention to. Nope, they have completely remodeled, remade the necromorphs from the ground up, keeping their silhouettes, keeping what was so special about them in the original, but basically constructing them layer by layer this time. They call it the peeling system, so that, for example, you could use your pulse rifle to shred the flesh of a necromorph, and then you could switch over and fire a ripper blade through its arm. That might leave the limb kind of hanging just by a tendon, and you could then rip that off with kinesis and pin the enemy to the wall with its own arm. And you do it step by step, layer by layer, piece by piece, chunk by chunk, lump by lump, fleshy morsel by delectable little slice of wonder. It's a great system, it feels very visceral, pun intended, and while I was only playing the earlier parts of the game, so I didn't have a full loadout of heaps of different weapons to use, I could already imagine some really creative scenarios that you can whip up, using different weapons in different areas to just make the gameplay feel a little bit more fresh at all times. One of the things the devs said actually were one of their favorite things to do was to use the force gun on the lurkers, which are these little baby things, and that force gun will basically peel away all of the skin and some of the flesh of the baby thing and just leave it as this internal skeleton with some extra kind of gloopy bits on it, and it just sounds dreadful. But that's exactly what I'm going for when I'm shooting a necromorph, so sign me up. The devs also mentioned that the lurkers were a bit too cartoony in the original, and so they went for this really gritty and overly realistic baby design thing, but they said that they modeled it over one of the devs' nephews, and I feel bad for that poor nephew if that's true. I couldn't tell if they were joking or not, but if that's legit, That's fantastic. The visuals also, I'm sure you've already been able to tell from the back and forth in this video, have improved massively since 2008. Here's a really cool comparison of what it used to look like and what it looks like now. It's pretty stark, the difference. And that's at least in part thanks to the fact that the game is in the Frostbite engine now. Now, we did ask if they have ambient occlusion ray tracing, and they said yes, but they weren't sure about DLSS. They're working on it right now. It's something that they've got to work with the Frostbite team for, so no concrete answer there. As the engineer of the ship, you can also turn the lights off in certain areas. Like, they wanted to reinforce that kind of engineer fantasy, if that's even a thing. I don't know, but they're letting people do it. You can control lighting. There's certain areas where you can turn on and off the vacuum, like gravity, stuff like that. So you've got agency over the space around you in some new fun ways. Now, this is a video from Mr. Awful Waffles, and it would not be complete without some discussion of Easter eggs. I actually already spotted and solved an Easter egg on the poster for the game. It's a really little dinky one, but this piece of text here translates quite happily to "Convergence is nigh. One mind, one soul, one body." A very cool touch for returning Dead Space fans. And I also asked the devs about this. I found this doll and asked if it was egg-related. Like I was saying, I'm ready for this thing to like grow an extra pair of arms and attack me, or I put in a button sequence and its head starts spinning around and it takes off and flies around the room. And their response was, there is stuff like that, but just not with that doll. There are old Easter eggs coming back. So for example, in the original game, there's a pentagram, I think, on the floor, and there are various codes and things written on the walls through the game, which are actually button inputs. And if you input those buttons at that pentagram, it spawns a bunch of stuff in. That's back, and so is the other stuff like it, but they have added some new things as well. For now, they're keeping it close to their chest, but you know me, I'm an Easter egg hunter. I'll be looking into that more as we get closer to launch. Now, you've probably been watching this gameplay and wondering why the hell it's stuttering so much, and why Isaac's head in certain areas is like glued to his shoulder, and the animations are a bit janky. And those are all things that the devs are well aware of, and some of them they've actually already fixed. It's just that the build that we were playing on was backdated from a little while ago, and so it wasn't 100% stable for us to be playing at the preview event. A couple of other things that happened, for example, we couldn't upgrade Isaac's suit after Chapter 1, or you'd fall through the floor. Classic video game development bug. And they're also still tweaking the loot tables. They think there might be a bit too much early game loot right now. And they also want Isaac to look around more at things that he sees in the environment. And that's all planned and intended and being worked on. It's just that, like I said, this was an early build. The game is not finished. And so all the stuttering that you see is there because of that. It was really unfortunate. Like, my immersion was really massively reduced by the fact that I was having to reload the game a bunch for the stuttering to get fixed. And even then, it was still present at pretty much all times. But I wasn't there at the event to judge it based on those kinks that I know are going to get worked out pre-launch, or I certainly freaking hope so. And so the things that I was judging, such as what it's like having an Isaac that talks, and whether the increased visual fidelity actually takes away from the horror rather than enhancing it, and whether or not the continuous no loading screen experience makes much of an impact. All those things I paid a lot of attention to, and they all landed really well. It's clear that the devs have paid a huge amount of attention to trying to essentially create the Dead Space that we all remember from 2008, but that only exists in our minds right now because when you go back and look at footage of the game, it looks so old. Our memories just don't match up with that because we remember it being this immersive, incredibly detailed graphic experience because that's what we were used to at the time. But now, graphics capabilities are much more improved. The sound improved, the immersion still present, the jump scares still very effective, and the overall feeling of the original Dead Space, in my opinion, is still very much there. If you want to see more Dead Space coverage from me on this channel, then make sure to let me know in the comments. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.